Hello and welcome back. Settle in tonight. Let the mattress take your weight. Let the day finally slide off your shoulders. Let whatever happened today become someone else's problem for the next couple of hours. Tonight, we're traveling to a wide granite plateau in southern Africa, to a city of stone walls that curve for hundreds of meters without a single drop of mortar holding them together. Walls that have stood quietly, patiently, for more than 600 years through drought and empire and the slow indifference of centuries. For over 100 years, the people who found these ruins simply refused to believe the truth sitting right in front of them, not because the evidence was unclear or the stones were ambiguous, but because the answer, once you actually looked at it honestly, was inconvenient to nearly everyone holding power at the time. Tonight isn't really a story about who built a city, though we will spend plenty of time with the builders themselves, their gold, their trade, their carved stone birds watching quietly from their granite perches. It's a story about how long people can go on insisting something obvious isn't true, generation after stubborn generation, and about the patient stonework and the even more patient scholars who eventually quietly outlasted them. You don't need to remember any of it. Let your eyes rest closed. Let your breathing slow in gently through the nose and out even more slowly. There's nothing to solve tonight, only a quiet stone city on a hillside and the long, slow work of finally being believed. Let's begin. The name Zimbabwe itself is a memory carved directly into language, drawn from the Shona phrase Zimbabwe, meaning simply houses of stone, a name given by the very people who raised those houses long before any outsider ever thought to write it down in a journal or a colonial report. Long before that outsider arrived, the communities living across this stretch of granite plateau already had their own word for the great walled cities scattered through their hills, a word that described exactly what made those places remarkable. Not gold, not kings, not conquest, but stone itself, patiently cut and stacked and made to outlast any single builder's own lifetime by centuries. When a nation later needed a new name to replace the one a colonial government had chosen for it, it didn't reach for something invented or borrowed from somewhere else entirely. It reached backward into its own language for a word that had been sitting there quietly the whole time, waiting. Sometimes the truest name for a place was never actually lost at all. It was only ever waiting, patiently, in plain sight, to be spoken again by the people it always belonged to. At the heart of the ruins stands the great enclosure, and its outer wall curves for roughly 250 meters without a single piece of mortar holding any of it together. An unbroken ring of granite balanced entirely on its own weight. Every block simply rests on the block beneath it, shaped and fitted by careful hand, trusting gravity and precision instead of any binding paste to hold the whole structure firm through centuries of sun, rain, and the occasional shudder of the earth itself. Walking its long curve today, a visitor's palm can still trace the seam between one stone and the next, cool granite meeting cool granite, exactly as it was left by whoever set it there, with no way of knowing that a stranger, centuries later, would still be running their fingers along that same seam in wonder. It is, in its own quiet way, an argument made entirely out of patience, proof that a wall doesn't need glue to hold together, only the certainty of someone who knew precisely, block by block, exactly where each stone belonged, and trusted that knowledge completely, without hesitation. Some sections of that same outer wall rise more than 11 meters into the open air, taller than a 3-story building, built entirely from granite stacked block upon block upon block, with nothing at all binding one course to the next but careful placement. Standing beneath it, the wall doesn't feel decorative or performative in the way a modern monument might. It feels deliberate, the kind of height meant to be seen and felt from a genuine distance, announcing something quietly about the people who lived behind it long before any visitor ever actually reached the entrance and stepped inside its shadow. No crane lifted these blocks into place, and no modern tool cut them square or true, only hands, and time, and an intention large enough to keep building steadily upward long after building simply outward would have been considerably easier, faster, and far less demanding on the builders themselves. It's worth sitting quietly with that scale for a moment tonight, letting it settle. How much sheer conviction it actually takes to keep raising a wall 11 meters into an open, indifferent sky, one patient stone at a time. The city itself was built and steadily, deliberately expanded by Shona-speaking Karanga peoples, growing gradually across roughly 4 centuries, from somewhere around the 11th century all the way into the 15th, a span of time longer than the entire history of most modern nations. That is long enough that no single generation of builders ever actually saw the whole finished project completed within their own lifetime. Children who watched their parents carefully lay the first courses of certain walls likely grew old and eventually died before those same walls ever reached their final intended height above the valley floor. Great Zimbabwe was never simply one person's vision, planned and completed within a single human lifetime, the way a modern building might rise and open within a year or two. It was something quieter and honestly far more remarkable than that, an idea passed carefully, deliberately, from hand to hand, from one generation to the next, each willing to keep building something they understood they might personally never live to see finished. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe may have housed as many as 18,000 people, a population size that places it comfortably among the genuinely significant cities of its entire era. Anywhere in the world, not merely within its own corner of the African continent. Picture, for a moment, that many separate lives moving quietly through the same stone passageways every single day. Cooking fires being lit at dawn, cattle being carefully led out to pasture along familiar paths, children weaving between market stalls, calling out to one another, elders sitting patiently in the shade cast by the same granite outcrops that still stand largely unchanged today. It was never simply a monument built to impress, frozen and empty, the way it feels to a modern visitor walking through in silence. It was a home filled with the ordinary, unremarkable business of 18,000 ordinary days, repeated quietly across generations, until eventually, gradually, it simply wasn't a home any longer. Inside the great enclosure stands the conical tower, a solid stone structure roughly 10 meters tall that has no known entrance. And even now, after a century and a half of dedicated study, no confirmed purpose whatsoever. It isn't hollow inside, and there's no door built anywhere into its base, no stairway winding upward, nothing at all to climb or store or hide within it. It simply exists, solid stone from its wide base to its rounded, tapering top, built using exactly the same careful dry stone technique found throughout the walls surrounding it. Archaeologists have studied this single tower for well over 100 years now, and still cannot say, with any real confidence, precisely why it was ever built this particular way, in this particular shape, in this particular place, at the center of the enclosure. Sometimes the most honest thing a place can tell you, gently in the dark, is that not every question you bring to it has an answer waiting quietly at the end. The leading theories for the conical tower's true purpose include the idea that it symbolized a grain bin, a solid stone monument built to represent royal wealth, and the reassuring promise of a full, secure harvest year after year, alongside broader theories connecting its shape to a chief's personal authority and the underlying security of his rule over the people gathered around him. Neither explanation can be fully proven outright, since the builders themselves left behind no inscriptions anywhere explaining their own private intentions for the structure they raised with such evident care. What survives instead is simply the shape itself, patient and rounded, standing exactly where it has always quietly stood, waiting for an answer that may never fully arrive. It's an unusually honest kind of monument in its own particular way, one that continues to let each new generation bring its own best, careful guess, without ever quite settling the underlying question for good. Scattered among the ruins, excavators eventually found 8 carved soapstone birds, each one originally perched atop tall, freestanding stone monoliths positioned around different parts of the site, watching outward over the valley below. Carved patiently from a soft green-gray soapstone, each bird combines features drawn from several different real birds into something quietly symbolic rather than strictly, literally realistic, with some carved examples featuring crocodile-like ridges worked carefully into the stone base beneath their clawed feet. No one alive today can say, with total confidence, exactly what each individual bird once represented to the people who originally carved it, whether honored ancestors, ruling chiefs, or something closer to a watchful guardian spirit overseeing the walls below through every season. They have simply outlasted, quietly, every possible explanation anyone has since offered for them. Patient stone witnesses to an entire language of meaning that time has since mostly worn gently away. Today, one of those same carved birds appears prominently on Zimbabwe's national flag, and another graces the country's official currency, making the Zimbabwe bird arguably the single most widely recognized symbol to emerge from the entire ruined city, more recognizable now than the ruins themselves to many. A carving originally meant, centuries ago, to sit quietly atop a single stone monolith, now flies instead, in careful miniature, on national banners and passports carried by millions of people who have never once personally stood beneath the real, original stone in the granite hills. It's a genuinely strange kind of afterlife for any single object to experience, quietly outliving the empire that first made it, and becoming instead, centuries later, the defining emblem of an entirely new nation built long after the original walls, had gone silent and still. One particular Zimbabwe bird carries its own, especially uncomfortable, complicated story, worth sitting with tonight. Looted from the ruins sometime during the colonial period, it ended up sitting for decades on Cecil Rhodes' own private estate in South Africa, a stolen carving displayed there quietly as a curiosity by the very kind of man whose entire colonial era worked so deliberately hard to deny the ruins' true African origin in the first place. It was only finally returned to Zimbabwe in 2003, well over a century after it had first been taken from its original home on the hillside. A single carved stone bird, waiting patiently on a shelf in someone else's private garden for the country it truly belonged to even exist again under its own freely chosen name. Some journeys home, it seems, simply take considerably longer than others to complete. Great Zimbabwe was never, in truth, really alone in the wider landscape it grew up within. It sits at the very center of a much larger network of more than 200 related stone-walled sites scattered across the wider region, each one built using recognizably similar dry stone construction techniques, passed carefully down through a shared, living tradition. Some of these related sites are far smaller cousins, modest walled compounds housing little more than a handful of extended families and their cattle. Others rival Great Zimbabwe's own considerable scale and evident ambition, rising just as tall along their own separate hillsides. Taken together, they describe something genuinely larger than any single ruin, however impressive on its own, could ever show entirely by itself. An entire shared tradition of skilled stone building carried and passed between neighboring communities across a wide stretch of southern Africa, long before any outside visitor from another continent ever arrived to document it. Among Great Zimbabwe's many sister sites are Kahme, Naletie, and Donongiombe, along with Manyikehni, situated further east in present-day Mozambique. Each one its own distinct chapter of the same larger story. Each of these related sites carries its own distinct architectural flourishes and local character, even while clearly still belonging to the same broader, shared stone building tradition. Different wall patterns here, different overall scales there, different local histories layered carefully onto a shared underlying foundation of technique and knowledge passed down through generations. Taken together, They read less like a handful of scattered, unrelated ruins, and more like separate chapters of one single continuing story, told patiently in granite across hundreds of kilometers and several distinct centuries, long after the very last stone at Great Zimbabwe itself had already been carefully set into place by its final builders. The city grew genuinely wealthy by quietly controlling something far more valuable, in the end, than the stone it was so famous for: the gold routes running steadily eastward toward the distant Indian Ocean coast, hundreds of kilometers away across open country. Great Zimbabwe didn't actually need to mine every single ounce of that gold itself out of its own soil, the way a modern mining operation might insist on doing. It needed only to sit astride the paths that gold naturally had to travel on its way toward the sea, quietly collecting tribute and valuable trade goods as they passed steadily through on their long journey eastward. Wealth, understood this way, wasn't simply dug directly out of the ground beneath the city's own feet. It was gathered patiently at the crossing point by a city that understood exactly, precisely where the wider world's traffic genuinely needed to pass through on its way to somewhere else entirely. That gold, mined laboriously across the wider surrounding plateau by hand, eventually reached major coastal trading ports as far away as Kilwa and Soapstone on the East African coast, joining an even larger Indian Ocean trading world that stretched all the way from Africa itself to Arabia, to India, and further still beyond the horizon. A single small nugget dug patiently from a narrow shaft somewhere on the Zimbabwean plateau might, months or even years later, be weighed carefully on a scale in a market thousands of kilometers away, exchanged there for cloth or beads or fine porcelain that would eventually make its own long, slow return journey back inland toward the plateau. Gold, in other words, never simply sat quietly in the ground waiting to be admired by whoever happened to find it. It moved patiently and steadily, quietly connecting one landlocked stone city to an ocean it never actually needed to see for itself. Among the objects archaeologists eventually recovered from the ruins is genuine Chinese Celadon porcelain, delicate green-glazed ceramic that had clearly traveled an extraordinary distance to end up buried, forgotten, in ordinary African soil far from the kilns that first fired it. Its quiet presence, there is undeniable proof that Great Zimbabwe's trading reach extended not merely to the nearby coast, a few hundred kilometers away, but all the way to East Asia itself, passing patiently through countless hands and ships and distant markets that most of the city's own residents would, of course, never personally see with their own eyes in their lifetime. A single small fragment of porcelain, easily small enough to fit inside one closed palm, carrying an entire vast trade route, folded invisibly, quietly inside it, waiting centuries to be dug up again. Alongside that same porcelain, excavators also uncovered Persian glazed pottery and delicate glass beads originating from workshops far away in the Near East, both turning up scattered patiently through the ruins' deeper layers of undisturbed soil beneath the walls. Each individual object represents its own entirely separate journey, its own separate chain of hands, passing it steadily along from one market to the next, until eventually, after who knows how many months or years on the road, it arrived here, inland, remarkably far from wherever its own particular journey first began beside some distant sea. It's a genuinely striking thing to sit with tonight, in the quiet, just how thoroughly, how deeply connected this single stone city on a distant southern African plateau actually was to a much wider medieval world. Most modern visitors don't usually picture stretching quite this far or quite this deep into the continent's interior. A coin from the Kilwa Sultanate, minted originally along the Swahili coast, was also recovered among the ruins, small and easy enough to overlook entirely next to more visually dramatic discoveries nearby. Yet quietly one of the clearest single proofs available of just how far great Zimbabwe's own trading relationships genuinely extended outward across the wider Indian Ocean world. A coin doesn't simply travel by pure accident or chance the way a seed carried on the wind might. It moves deliberately because someone along its route trusted it would still hold real value on the far other end of a very long, uncertain journey inland. Whoever eventually carried that particular small coin so far from the coast was carrying, in a very literal and tangible sense, proof of trust stretched patiently across an enormous, uncertain distance, hand to hand, market to market, before great Zimbabwe itself ever rose to prominence. A smaller predecessor state called Mapungubwe had already flourished at the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers, developing many of the same trading relationships with the Indian Ocean coast that great Zimbabwe would later inherit, and expand considerably further. Mapungubwe was abandoned sometime in the late 13th century for reasons that remain genuinely unclear even now, and the center of regional power simply gradually shifted northward to a site with better agricultural land and closer access to the gold fields feeding the coastal trade. Historians estimate that as much as 8 tons of gold moved annually through the wider trading network. Great Zimbabwe eventually came to control. Before the 16th century disrupted those old, established patterns for good. Picture that quietly for a moment, 8 tons every single year, dug patiently from narrow hand-cut shafts across the plateau, carried steadily eastward, and exchanged at the coast for cloth and porcelain and glass. An entire economy built on gold that never once needed a formal currency of its own to move so efficiently across such enormous distances. That trade depended entirely on the seasonal rhythm of the monsoon winds sweeping across the Indian Ocean, blowing steadily one direction for months at a time before reversing course entirely and blowing the opposite way. Traders leaving the East African coast for Arabia, India, and eventually China rode those same predictable winds outward, then waited, sometimes for the better part of a year, for the seasonal reversal that would carry them patiently home again. Their holds now filled with porcelain and cloth instead of the gold and ivory they had carried away. Among the finer imported ceramics recovered from the ruins are fragments of long quinceladon, a distinctive green-glazed Chinese stoneware, alongside pieces of genuine blue and white porcelain dating to the 14th and 15th centuries, precisely the era when great Zimbabwe's own trading power was at its very height. These weren't cheap, everyday trade goods passed carelessly from hand to hand. They were luxury items carefully carried thousands of miles specifically because someone on this inland plateau had both the wealth and the standing to want them for their own household. Copper also moved steadily through the city's markets, arriving from mining regions far to the north in what is now Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, often cast into distinctive X-shaped ingots, specifically designed for easy carrying and easy, standardized trading across long overland distances. A trader could count ingots at a glance, the way a modern shopper might count coins. A simple, elegant solution to the basic problem every long-distance trading network eventually has to solve for itself. Cattle hides, too, formed a steady part of the outward trade alongside gold and ivory, tanned and prepared locally before making their own slower journey toward the coast. It's easy tonight to picture only gold and porcelain when imagining this trade, the glamorous objects that survive well in the archaeological record. But an economy this size depended just as much on the ordinary, patient work of herding, tanning, and preparing goods that mostly quietly rotted away centuries ago, leaving barely a trace behind for anyone to later find. The earliest surviving written account of the ruins by any European visitor came from a Portuguese soldier named Vicente Pagiado, writing in the year 1531, decades before most of Europe had any real sense the plateau even existed. He described stone structures that were, even by his own relatively early era, already considered ancient, already surrounded by rich local stories and oral traditions, carefully explaining their origin to anyone curious enough to ask about them. Pagiado's account matters today, in the end, not because it discovered anything genuinely new or previously unknown. The ruins, after all, had never actually been lost to the people who lived among them and cared for them across centuries. It matters simply because it happens to be the earliest moment any outside written record chose to mention what local communities had, quite plainly, already known all along, for generations before he ever arrived. Portuguese traders who eventually reached the wider region also carefully recorded oral histories directly connecting the ruins to a still living royal dynasty situated further north, the Mutiahpa state, whose own rulers were understood, even at that time, to trace their political authority directly back toward Great Zimbabwe's original royal lineage across the generations. In other words, the very same people that later colonial explorers would insist simply couldn't possibly explain the ruins had, centuries earlier, already explained them clearly enough for Portuguese visitors themselves to carefully write it all down in their own reports home. The true answer, it turns out, was never actually missing at all, hidden somewhere waiting to be uncovered by a foreign expert. It simply wasn't, later on, the answer certain visitors happened to want to hear when they finally arrived. Great Zimbabwe was likely abandoned sometime by the mid-15th century, which quietly means it had already fallen silent, empty, for decades, possibly considerably longer, before any Portuguese explorer ever actually laid eyes on the ruins themselves in person. Whatever specific forces eventually led its residents to leave the city behind for good, They had clearly finished that difficult, gradual work long before Europe's own written historical record of the site had even properly begun to take shape on paper. The city's active, thriving life, and its later written history, in other words, never genuinely overlapped at all in real time. One had already ended quietly, gradually, before the other one ever truly started to exist. Historians today point to several leading, plausible theories for why the city was eventually abandoned by so many of its residents over time. Soil exhaustion, following generations of intensive local farming on the same fields, overgrazing caused by the substantial cattle herds the wider economy so heavily depended upon year after year, and a gradual, steady shift in the region's gold trade routes, moving slowly northward toward entirely new emerging centers of power and influence. None of these particular theories require any conquest or sudden catastrophe to make good sense of the evidence. Sometimes a genuinely great city simply, quietly outgrows the land immediately supporting it, and its people eventually choose, calmly and deliberately, to begin again somewhere the local resources haven't yet been stretched quite so thin by centuries of steady, patient use. A period of sustained regional drought, occurring around roughly the same time as the city's broader decline, may also have played its own quiet, contributing part in all of this, gradually pushing an already strained population to disperse in search of more reliable water and grazing land elsewhere on the plateau. Stone walls, after all, can survive a drought perfectly well, indefinitely even, standing firm through decades without a single drop of rain. People and cattle simply cannot manage the same. When water eventually becomes scarce enough, for long enough, even the most magnificent surrounding architecture in the world genuinely cannot hold a population firmly in place against the simple, deeply unglamorous need to keep eating and drinking and surviving another difficult season. When the German explorer Karl Moak finally reached the ruins in 1871, he became, by his own personal account, the very first European ever to see them, and almost immediately, within moments of arriving on the hillside, he refused outright to believe that local Africans could possibly have built them with their own hands. Standing directly in front of walls constructed with genuine, considerable skill and enormous, sustained labor stretching back centuries, Moch's own mind reached quietly past the most obvious available explanation and searched instead almost reflexively, for someone else entirely, from somewhere else entirely, to credit for the achievement. It's a small, deeply telling moment within this whole larger story tonight, not really about what the walls themselves actually showed him plainly in the afternoon light, but rather about what he simply, stubbornly could not allow himself to see standing right there. Mach speculated instead, with considerable confidence for a man with no actual evidence, that the ruins were somehow directly linked to the biblical Queen of Sheba, or perhaps to King Solomon's own legendary land of Ophir, weaving together an entire imagined history out of half-remembered scripture, rather than simply accepting the evidence sitting directly in front of him on the hillside. It was, without question, a far more comfortable story for a 19th century European explorer to tell himself and others back home. One that quietly borrowed its grandeur from familiar biblical legend, rather than honestly crediting the achievement to the very people already living there, tending the land around the ruins as their own ancestors always had. Comfortable stories like this one, though, tend to have a way of eventually being asked, sooner or later, to properly answer to the facts, waiting patiently underneath them. Cecil Rhodes, the wealthy businessman and colonial administrator, whose own name would later be given, uncomfortably, to the entire surrounding territory for decades, personally funded several early excavations of the ruins through his own British South Africa Company. This was never simply neutral, disinterested scientific curiosity quietly at work on an interesting old ruin. Rhodes held a very specific, deliberate political interest in shaping the ruins' origin story, since a foreign-built city fit far more comfortably, far more usefully, into the broader colonial narrative his own company was actively constructing across the entire region at the time, one excavation report at a time. Funding, as it turns out, rarely arrives anywhere in this world without its own quiet, unstated set of expectations firmly attached to it, whether the funded party admits as much or not. The excavator Rhodes personally funded, J. Theodore Bent, published his own official conclusions in 1891, stating quite plainly that the ruins were, in his professional judgment, not African in origin at all, despite everything standing before him. His actual methods were far from rigorous by any later, proper archaeological standard developed in the decades that followed, and his conclusions happened rather conveniently to match exactly what his own funder already wanted the wider public to believe about the site. It's a genuinely useful reminder tonight, resting here in the dark, that even findings carefully dressed up in the confident language of scientific authority can, quite often, simply be echoing back the pre-existing assumptions of whoever happened to be paying for the shovel in the first place. A later excavator, Richard Nicklin Hall, went considerably further still than Bent ever had, physically digging out and simply discarding entire archaeological layers that directly contradicted the foreign origin theory he personally preferred to believe about the site. Rather than carefully recording every single layer of soil for exactly what it actually contained, regardless of what conclusions it happened to suggest, Hall instead removed entire sections he had already judged irrelevant based on conclusions he had quietly decided were true long before he ever picked up a single trowel on site. It's one thing, after all, to misread available evidence honestly, in good faith, the way an earlier researcher might. It's an entirely different thing to physically remove the evidence itself so that it can no longer be allowed to disagree with you at all. Hall's genuinely destructive digging, carried out steadily between 1902 and 1904 across large sections of the site, ultimately destroyed irreplaceable stratigraphy that professional archaeologists still, even today, genuinely regret losing forever. Stratigraphy, the careful, undisturbed layering of soil that lets patient researchers read a site's entire history, the way rings inside a tree trunk quietly reveal a forest's true age, simply cannot ever be put back once it has been carelessly disturbed and removed from where it settled. Whatever precise, valuable details those permanently lost layers might once have revealed about the site's earliest years are now simply gone permanently, because one single man was, in the end, far more interested in confirming his own answer than in honestly, carefully discovering the truth underneath it. The first properly trained professional archaeologist to seriously study the site arrived considerably later. In 1905, a British researcher named David Randall MacIver, carrying with him an entirely different approach than his predecessors had brought before him. Unlike his several predecessors before him, Randall MacIver approached the ruins carrying genuine scientific method with him rather than a predetermined conclusion, simply waiting patiently to be confirmed and validated by whatever evidence happened to turn up. It's a small but genuinely important shift within this larger story tonight. The precise moment actual, careful methodology finally arrived at a site that had, until that point, mostly attracted people looking primarily to prove what they already quietly believed beforehand about who could and couldn't have built it. Randall MacIver's own careful, patient methods eventually led him to a conclusion his predecessors had clearly worked rather hard to avoid reaching. No matter how the evidence pointed that the ruins were unmistakably medieval in age and unmistakably, undeniably African in origin from the first stone to the last. It was a verdict that colonial authorities of the time very much disliked hearing spoken aloud, since it directly, plainly undercut the comfortable foreign builder narrative so many earlier accounts had leaned so heavily upon for years by that point. Evidence, gathered honestly and carefully, simply doesn't pause to ask anyone's permission before quietly contradicting a comfortable, familiar story that people have grown attached to. A more rigorous, more carefully conducted excavation followed in 1929, led this time by British archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson, and her own independent findings reached the exact identical conclusion that Randall MacIver had already reached, entirely separately, more than 2 decades earlier, on the very same hillside. 2 separate, professionally conducted excavations, working independently of one another and separated by a generation, arrived at precisely the same considered answer: that great Zimbabwe was, unmistakably, the genuine achievement of the very African communities living around it all along, generation after patient generation. The evidence itself, examined honestly a second time by careful, trained eyes, simply, quietly agreed with itself once more. Catton Thompson's own excavation team notably included several pioneering female archaeologists, working steadily within a field that was, at the time, still almost entirely dominated by men in every visible position of authority and funding. It's genuinely worth pausing here tonight, just for a moment in the quiet, on that particular detail, a team already quietly pushing back against one set of deeply held assumptions about who properly belonged in serious archaeological work at all, simultaneously pushing back just as firmly against an entirely separate set of assumptions about who could possibly have built one of Africa's most genuinely significant ancient cities. And yet, despite 2 entirely separate, professionally conducted excavations, both confirming the identical African origin decades apart from one another. The white minority Rhodesian government that later came to govern the territory continued, quite deliberately, to suppress this settled finding for decades afterward, well into the 20th century. Having the correct answer already firmly in hand, it turns out, is sometimes simply not nearly enough on its own to make people already holding power actually accept it and act accordingly, particularly when that truth threatens to unravel an entire political narrative they have built a whole colonial project carefully around for their own benefit. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, Rhodesian museum guides and official school textbooks alike were actively, deliberately pressured to describe the ruins' true origin as somehow still genuinely unresolved, even though the professional archaeological consensus had, by that point, already been thoroughly settled for decades by careful, independent researchers. Generations of schoolchildren and countless ordinary visitors passing quietly through the site itself over the years on holiday were quietly handed a deliberately vague, deliberately incomplete version of a story that professional researchers had already carefully answered, not once, but twice over. Some Rhodesian officials went even further still than mere textbook edits, reportedly threatening the professional careers of archaeologists who dared to state plainly, in public, that Africans had genuinely built Great Zimbabwe with their own hands and their own knowledge. It's a genuinely sobering thing to sit with tonight, here in the dark, that simply stating an already thoroughly proven, thoroughly evidenced fact out loud could still carry real professional risk for someone purely because that fact happened to be politically inconvenient to the people holding power at that particular moment in the country's history. When southern Rhodesia finally achieved its own independence in 1980, after a long and difficult struggle, the newly formed nation deliberately chose to rename itself Zimbabwe, directly honoring the very ruins whose true origin its own previous government had spent decades actively trying to obscure and deny to its own citizens. It was a quiet, deeply deliberate act of correction, an entire country choosing, at the precise moment of its own political rebirth, to publicly, permanently reclaim the achievement that colonial authority had worked so hard for so long to insist it never truly had. Great Zimbabwe was formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, cementing genuine international acknowledgement of exactly what generations of local communities and eventually rigorous, patient archaeology had already quietly confirmed all along, decades before the recognition ever formally arrived on paper. It's a fitting kind of ending to this particular chapter of the story tonight. Not a new discovery at all, in truth, simply the wider world's own official institutions finally, formally catching up to a truth that had genuinely never, at any single point, actually been in serious doubt among those who looked honestly. Turning now to how the walls themselves were actually built, stone by careful stone. The granite came from blocks split naturally along the rock's own internal grain lines rather than being violently hammered or laboriously carved into shape by brute force alone. Builders learned patiently over generations of practice to read the stone the way a skilled woodworker learns to read the grain running through a plank of timber, understanding exactly where the granite naturally wanted to separate cleanly, rather than fighting stubbornly against it every single step of the way through the process. It's a technique fundamentally built on quiet cooperation with the material itself, rather than raw force simply applied against it from the outside. Remarkably, these same builders shaped enormous quantities of hard granite across the entire hillside, without ever having access to iron tools sturdy enough to cut directly into the stone by brute force. They relied on an intimate, deeply practiced understanding of exactly how granite naturally tends to fracture along its hidden seams, using careful fire, water, and patient, sustained pressure to coax individual blocks free along their own pre-existing natural weaknesses, one at a time. The tools available to them by any modern industrial standard were genuinely modest, little more than fire and patience and hardened wooden wedges. The underlying understanding behind how to use them so effectively, clearly, plainly, was not modest at all. This same dry stone technique gave the finished walls a genuinely useful hidden benefit that rigid mortar alone could never have provided them. The quiet ability to flex slightly rather than crack outright during the region's occasional seismic activity over the centuries. Stacked, unmortared stone can shift and gently resettle itself without shattering apart entirely, absorbing sudden movement in a way a rigidly mortared wall simply structurally cannot manage under the same conditions. 600 years spent standing upright through storms and tremors alike is, in its own quiet way, ongoing proof that the original builders understood something genuinely important about flexibility that rigid permanence alone could never, on its own, have achieved for them. The hill complex, the oldest section of the entire site, and the first to rise above the surrounding plain, likely served originally as a royal residence, deliberately positioned high enough to overlook both the valley and the rest of the wider settlement, gradually spreading out below it over the generations. Whoever lived there, generation after generation, would have woken each morning to a commanding, sweeping view of the entire city slowly taking shape beneath them, its walls rising gradually across many decades, exactly as they had risen, just as gradually across the many decades that came steadily before that particular morning. The great enclosure itself stands today as the largest single ancient structure found anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, a genuinely remarkable claim to be able to make about any single building in any country, on any continent. Its sheer scale alone would already be impressive in absolutely any era, in any part of the entire world, let alone one built entirely without draft animals or wheeled transport. That it was raised entirely by hand, without any beasts of burden, genuinely suited to hauling heavy stone across the site, and without any mechanical lifting device whatsoever to ease the labor, only deepens considerably exactly how extraordinary an achievement it genuinely represents when you actually stop to consider it properly tonight. Inside the great enclosure, a narrow stone passage runs quietly parallel to the outer wall along its entire considerable length, creating a hidden, almost secretive corridor tucked between two towering sections of dense stonework rising high on either side. Walking it today, the open sky above narrows down to a thin, distant ribbon far overhead, cool granite pressing in close on either side of the visitor as their footsteps echo softly. It's a genuinely intimate, almost private space tucked directly inside a structure that is, everywhere else across the site, deliberately built on such an imposing, public, outward-facing scale meant to be seen from a distance. Notably, no weapons of real significance and no serious fortifications have ever actually been found anywhere at the site, despite decades of careful excavation, strongly suggesting these massive, towering walls were never truly built with the specific intention of withstanding any kind of prolonged military siege. Instead, their impressive height and considerable scale most likely signaled something else entirely to anyone approaching from a distance: status, accumulated wealth, and lasting permanence, rather than any genuine military necessity born of conflict. Sometimes the single most imposing structure standing in an entire landscape isn't actually built to keep real danger firmly out at all. It's built, quite simply, to be seen clearly and remembered fondly and respected properly by everyone who passes near it. Some sections of wall also carry deliberate chevron and herringbone decorative patterns worked directly into the individual stone courses themselves, purely ornamental flourishes carefully layered onto structures that were, on a purely practical level, already entirely functional and complete without them. Someone, at some point in the wall's long construction, made a conscious decision to make these particular sections genuinely beautiful, not merely sturdy and useful for keeping the elements out, taking the extra time and considerable extra effort to arrange individual stones in deliberate, pleasing patterns, purely for the sake of how the finished wall would eventually look and feel to everyone who ever passed quietly beside it on their way through. Great Zimbabwe has no surviving system of writing entirely of its own, which quietly means that almost everything now known about the city's rich inner life comes instead from careful, patient archaeology and long-preserved oral tradition passed faithfully down through many generations of storytellers. There is no royal decree anywhere left to read on a shelf somewhere. No merchant's careful ledger anywhere left to consult for details of trade. Only stone, soil, and the patient, careful, unglamorous work of piecing together an entire coherent story from what physically, tangibly remains buried in the ground, and from what has been faithfully remembered aloud, voice to voice, across centuries of quiet retelling. Even today, local Shona communities continue to regard Great Zimbabwe as a genuinely active spiritual site, closely tied to rainmaking ceremonies that are still, even now, faithfully observed throughout the surrounding region each year when the rains grow uncertain. The ruins were never simply abandoned entirely to history, treated only as some distant archaeological curiosity behind a rope barrier for tourists to photograph. For the people who trace their own heritage directly back to its original builders, generation after generation, The site has remained meaningfully, continuously alive all along, long after its original walls finally stopped growing any taller against the sky. Spirit mediums historically associated closely with the ruins were traditionally consulted on important matters of drought and harvest, serving faithfully as a spiritual bridge, connecting the living community directly to the deeper history. The stones themselves quietly represented across the generations. Their ongoing role speaks to something considerably larger than pure archaeology alone can ever fully capture on its own. However careful and thorough that archaeology might be, it speaks to a genuinely living, continuous relationship between people and a specific place that has quietly outlasted every single colonial attempt to reduce great Zimbabwe down to nothing more than an empty, silent ruin on a hill. The Mutiahpa state, situated further north and described in real detail by Portuguese chroniclers who encountered it directly and firsthand during their travels, is now widely considered a genuine political successor to Great Zimbabwe's own original royal lineage stretching back generations. Political power, in other words, didn't simply vanish entirely the moment the original city was finally abandoned by its last residents. It migrated instead, carried steadily forward by descendants and later successors who continued much of the same underlying tradition of authority and long-distance trade, just in a new location further along the same unbroken thread of history. A closely related dynasty, known as the Tiorwa, went on to build the Kahmi ruins after Great Zimbabwe's own eventual decline, reusing remarkably similar dry stone building techniques passed carefully down through the very same broader building tradition that had shaped the earlier city. The specific city itself changed considerably over time, its walls rising in a new location with their own particular style. The underlying knowledge, precisely how to read granite properly, how to stack it securely without any mortar, how to raise a wall genuinely capable of standing firm for centuries, quite clearly did not simply disappear along with the abandoned capital. Radiocarbon dating of carefully preserved wood and other organic material recovered from deep within the site has helped modern archaeologists confirm its medieval timeline with far greater scientific precision than early visual estimates alone could ever have managed on their own. No matter how confident those early guesses sounded. Where 19th century explorers once guessed wildly, sometimes off by many thousands of years in either direction, depending purely on their own assumptions, modern dating methods have since anchored the site firmly, specifically within the exact centuries its own original builders actually occupied and steadily, patiently expanded it. Pottery seriation, the careful, methodical practice of tracking precisely how ceramic styles gradually changed over time across many excavated layers, has also helped researchers date the site's different construction phases with genuine, well-earned confidence rather than mere guesswork. Each subtle shift in decoration or overall shape effectively becomes its own small, remarkably reliable clock, letting patient archaeologists read the steady passage of centuries in something as ordinary, as easily overlooked by a casual visitor as a single broken cooking pot buried quietly in the soil beneath their feet. Some early European visitors simply assumed, without any real supporting evidence whatsoever beyond their own preconceptions, that the ruins must somehow predate any African settlement of the region by many thousands of years, imagining an entirely separate, far older civilization responsible for the walls instead of the people living nearby. This particular idea has since been thoroughly, repeatedly disproven by every serious excavation conducted since Randall MacIver's own careful work began the process. The true timeline was, in the end, never actually genuinely mysterious in any real sense. It simply took many long decades of careful, patient, honest work to finally convince certain stubborn people to accept what the evidence itself had already quietly shown them all along. The word Rhodesia, the colonial name once formally given to this entire territory in honor of Cecil Rhodes himself and his commercial ambitions there, was specifically, deliberately replaced at independence to properly honor this site's true original builders instead of the man who funded its denial. It's a genuinely pointed piece of historical symmetry to consider tonight, resting quietly here, an entire country choosing, quite deliberately, to erase the name of the very man who had funded active efforts to deny African achievement on this exact hillside, replacing that name instead with the very same name that achievement had quietly, always rightfully carried. Modern Zimbabwean currency and official passports still proudly carry the Zimbabwe bird as an enduring, everyday symbol of national identity, carrying that same carved image, now many centuries old, into the most ordinary, unremarkable corners of everyday modern life across the country. Every single time a passport gets carefully stamped at a border crossing, or a banknote quietly changes hands between two strangers in a marketplace, a small piece of great Zimbabwe's original artistry travels along quietly with it, still doing its own patient, quiet work of representing an entire nation to the world. Taken together, Great Zimbabwe remains one of the clearest examples found anywhere in archaeology of a genuine finding being deliberately, repeatedly suppressed for openly political reasons, rather than any genuine scientific uncertainty. It is not, in the end, a story about genuinely ambiguous evidence or about some honestly difficult scientific puzzle requiring decades of debate to resolve. It is a story about evidence that was already clear from the very first properly conducted professional excavation, met instead by generations of people determined, stubbornly, not to believe it regardless of what they were shown. The stones themselves, for their own quiet part, simply kept standing patiently until enough people were finally genuinely willing to listen to what they had always been saying. Archaeologists carefully studying the great enclosure stonework have identified several distinct construction phases, formally classified into styles labeled P, Q, and PQ, based specifically on how neatly and consistently the individual granite blocks were carefully coursed together, course by course, wall by wall. Reading these different building styles side by side today is a little like reading the rings inside an old tree trunk, each successive layer quietly recording a different generation's own hand at work, a different specific moment in the wall's long, gradual, steady growth over 4 centuries of patient building. The earliest and noticeably roughest sections, known formally as style P walls, were laid with visibly less careful coursing than the elegant, tightly fitted Q-style walls that were built considerably later in the site's long history by more practiced hands. It's genuinely easy to imagine the builders themselves growing steadily more confident and more skilled across successive generations of practice, each newly built section slightly more refined than the one immediately before it, until eventually the walls achieved the polished, almost seamless precision that visitors still openly admire today. Centuries later, without knowing quite how it happened, British archaeologist Peter Garlake's 1973 study of the ruins remains. Even now, one of the single most influential works ever written about the site's true, accurate chronology, carefully separating solid archaeological fact from decades of politically motivated speculation that had accumulated steadily before him from earlier, less careful researchers. His careful research helped finally settle, with genuine scholarly authority behind it, questions that decades of earlier, deliberately biased excavation had left conveniently, stubbornly murky for anyone who preferred not to look too closely at the evidence itself. Garlake's own plain-spoken conclusion that Africans had unquestionably built the site themselves, with skill and patience passed through generations, ultimately cost him his professional position in white-ruled Rhodesia, and he left the country not terribly long afterward as a direct result of stating the obvious truth. Even by the 1970, nearly half a century after Catton Thompson's own confirming excavation had already settled the matter beyond reasonable doubt, simply stating that settled truth plainly, out loud, in public, could apparently still end a promising career. Some truths, it seems, genuinely take an uncomfortably long time to finally become safe enough to say aloud. Zimbabwean archaeologist Innocent Pkrye has spent decades of his own dedicated career carefully studying how Great Zimbabwe's eventual decline connects meaningfully to a much broader, longer pattern found across the wider Zimbabwe cultures, later successor capitals scattered across the region. His careful, sustained work situates the city not as some isolated, standalone mystery sitting alone on a hillside, but instead as one genuinely meaningful chapter within a considerably longer, continuous regional story of rising, shifting centers of power across many patient generations. That same broader political center of gravity moved at least 3 separate times after Great Zimbabwe's own eventual decline, shifting first toward Kahme and eventually further still toward the emerging Rose v. state that followed it decades later. Power, across these many centuries, behaved considerably less like a single flame simply going out for good and leaving only darkness behind, and considerably more like a lit torch passed carefully, deliberately from one waiting hand to the next, never fully extinguished at any single point, simply carried steadily onward instead through each new generation. The Rose v. Empire, emerging gradually during the 17th century out of the political landscape left behind, eventually absorbed the Torwa dynasty, that had ruled steadily for generations from Kahme, folding one older, established tradition carefully into a newer, considerably larger political structure, spanning an even wider territory, even centuries after great Zimbabwe itself had already fallen entirely quiet, and its walls stopped echoing with daily life. The deeper cultural and political tradition it had originally carefully established was still very much alive and well, still reshaping itself patiently to meet each genuinely new era as it arrived. According to Shona oral tradition, a member of Great Zimbabwe's own royal family named Nyatsimba Mutiohta led part of the city's population northward in search of salt, eventually founding an entirely new kingdom, the Mutiohta Empire, that would go on to dominate the northern part of the plateau for centuries afterward. It's a wonderfully human detail to sit with tonight, that one of the most consequential political splits in the region's entire history may have begun with something as ordinary and as necessary as the simple need to find more salt. Some historians believe the migration north was driven less by salt alone and more by a succession dispute within the royal family, with a branch that lost out on ruling Great Zimbabwe directly choosing, instead, to establish its own entirely separate seat of power elsewhere. Oral tradition holds that only the most recent ancestors were expected to follow the migrating group north, while the older, more distant ancestral spirits were understood to remain behind, still quietly watching over Great Zimbabwe itself. Further west, the successor city of Kahme eventually became the capital of the Torwa state. Its own walls, built using a visibly different decorative technique than Great Zimbabwe's, featuring checkerboard and herringbone patterns, worked carefully into the stone facing. Different generations, working in a different place, still reaching for the same underlying tradition of dry stone mastery, but each finding their own particular way to make it unmistakably, visibly their own. Two further Torwa centers, Nale and Donongioembe, carried this same stone building tradition forward into the 16th and 17th centuries, their walls featuring some of the most elaborately decorated stonework found anywhere across the entire Zimbabwe culture's long architectural history. Nale in particular is often singled out by researchers for the sheer intricacy of its decorative coursing, a testament to just how far this building tradition had continued to develop. Long after the original hillside at Great Zimbabwe had already gone quiet, taken together, this entire sequence from Mapungubwe to Great Zimbabwe to Kahme to Nale and Donangioembe, and finally to the Mutihpa Empire in the north, forms a single continuous story spanning nearly 7 centuries, each capital rising as the one before it declined, each generation carrying the same essential knowledge of stone forward into a new place, a new era, a new set of challenges, entirely its own. Excavators have found clear, unambiguous evidence of iron smelting furnaces situated near Great Zimbabwe, indicating the city clearly supported its own dedicated metalworking industry rather than relying entirely on tools and finished metal imported from elsewhere along the trade routes. Turning raw ore into genuinely usable iron requires sustained, controlled heat, careful practiced technique passed down through skilled hands, and considerable accumulated skill built up over years of practice. It stands as one more quiet reminder tonight of just how thoroughly self-sufficient and technically capable this entire community genuinely was. In nearly every practical respect, a growing city might need spindle whorls recovered carefully from the ruins, suggest that cotton was regularly spun and patiently woven into finished cloth directly on site, revealing an entire additional craft tradition operating quietly alongside the more visible, more celebrated achievements of stonework and long-distance trade that draw most modern attention. Somewhere among these very walls, someone once sat quietly, patiently twisting raw fiber into usable thread day after ordinary day, season after season, producing cloth that has long since completely disintegrated in the soil, leaving behind only the small, humble stone tool that once helped carefully make it by hand. Cattle herding formed the true, underlying backbone of the entire local economy, functioning simultaneously as a genuinely practical food source for the growing population, a reliable store of easily transferable wealth between families, and a clearly visible marker of social status within the wider community gathered around the walls. A single family's herd said something meaningful about their overall standing, much the way currency might function elsewhere in the world, walking wealth grazing quietly, visibly across the surrounding hillsides for all their neighbors to see, and quietly measure against their own across the wider Zimbabwean plateau. Small-scale ancient gold mining pits, some barely wider than a single person's shoulders, still dot the surrounding landscape by the many thousands, even today, scattered across hills most visitors never think to look at twice. Each individual narrow shaft represents its own separate, physically demanding personal effort. Someone descending carefully into cramped, hand-dug darkness in dedicated pursuit of the very gold that would eventually help fund an entire flourishing trading empire above ground, far above their own bent head and aching shoulders. Those individual miners are believed to have carefully followed gold-bearing quartz veins entirely by hand, patiently working narrow shafts with nothing more than simple stone and basic iron tools passed down and shared among the community. There was no map anywhere showing precisely where the gold actually sat waiting underground for someone patient enough to find it. Only patient, practiced reading of the stone itself, vein by careful vein, shaft by narrow shaft, dug one at a time across a working lifetime spent underground, and above it in equal measure. Trade wind glass beads originally produced in distant workshops across the Islamic world and carried steadily down the East African coast by sustained ocean trade over many generations, turn up scattered throughout the ruins in genuinely considerable quantities today, tiny and colorful against the gray granite. Each individual small bead traveled an enormous, almost unimaginable distance to eventually end up here, inland, buried quietly in soil that has since kept it perfectly safe and largely undisturbed for many hundreds of years, waiting patiently for someone to notice its long journey. Some archaeologists interpret the great enclosure's genuinely distinctive design, a wall built entirely within another, larger surrounding wall, layered like something deliberately private, as connected meaningfully to a young woman's coming-of-age initiation or fertility ritual, reading the layered architecture itself as symbolic of transition, growth, and renewal across a lifetime. It remains one interpretation among several genuinely competing possibilities, none of them fully provable on their own from the stone alone, each offering its own thoughtful, careful way of imagining what this particular space may once have meant to the people who gathered there. Others read that very same structure quite differently, instead as a dedicated residence built specifically for a king's senior wives, an interpretation that remains actively, genuinely debated among researchers even today, decades after it was first proposed by careful scholars studying the layout. Both competing readings simply cannot be simultaneously proven fully true from the evidence available. And perhaps, in the end, neither one fully captures exactly what the space actually, personally meant to the people who used it daily, quietly, without ever writing their private reasons down for us to find. The narrow parallel passage running quietly inside the great enclosure is sometimes referred to as the inner sanctum, a name reflecting its genuinely private, almost hidden character when compared against the site's considerably more open, public spaces elsewhere on the hillside, tucked carefully between two towering sections of dense wall, rising close on either side. It feels deliberately set apart from everything else around it, a space clearly meant for only a few people at any given time, rather than the wider community moving freely through the enclosure beyond its narrow entrance. Some scholars have proposed that the site's overall layout may deliberately track seasonal risings of particular stars, or perhaps the sun itself, at key moments of the year, hinting at a possible hidden astronomical dimension folded quietly into the architecture by builders watching the sky. This particular reading remains genuinely contested among researchers today, neither firmly, conclusively confirmed through hard evidence, nor entirely, fully dismissed either by those who study it closely. It's exactly the kind of open, unresolved question that keeps a well-studied site like this one from ever feeling completely, tidily finished. Vegetation growth, quietly working its way between the loosely stacked stones, represents one of the site's most persistent, ongoing conservation threats even today, as small roots slowly work their patient way into gaps that were genuinely never meant to hold anything at all beyond careful, deliberate human hands, placing stone upon stone, left entirely unmanaged for even a few seasons. A single small seedling today can, given enough patient years, to grow and thicken, quietly undo stonework that has already, remarkably, survived 6 entire centuries of everything else the world has thrown at it. Tourist foot traffic, passing steadily across centuries-old stone surfaces, has, in more recent decades, forced modern conservators to carefully rope off some of the ruins' most fragile sections entirely for their own long-term protection against where no ancient builder ever anticipated It's a genuinely delicate, ongoing balance to manage carefully year after year, welcoming exactly the kind of curious visitors whose sustained interest helps fund the site's ongoing preservation efforts, while simultaneously protecting stonework that simply, honestly wasn't built to withstand quite this much steady, curious modern footfall on its ancient surfaces. Today, the site continues to draw visitors from across the entire world, making it one of Zimbabwe's most genuinely significant sources of heritage tourism revenue by a considerable margin over any other single site in the country. A wall originally raised centuries ago to project the authority of a medieval African kingdom now, all these centuries later, quietly helps support the modern nation that eventually rose in its honor in ways its original builders could obviously never possibly have anticipated as they set each individual stone in place. Despite settled, decades-old archaeological consensus on the matter, confirmed independently by multiple researchers across multiple generations, certain pseudo-archaeology documentaries still occasionally repeat the old, thoroughly discredited claim that non-African builders were somehow genuinely responsible for the ruins standing on the hillside. Old myths, once they take firm root in the wider popular imagination through repetition, have a genuinely stubborn way of persisting and resurfacing again and again, no matter how firmly, how repeatedly the actual evidence has already quietly settled the underlying question for anyone willing to look. Local Shona oral tradition carefully preserves detailed stories of the site's own royal lineage that predate any written European account of the ruins by many centuries, passed carefully from elder to child around countless fires long before any outsider arrived. Long before Vicente Pagisto ever set down his own written record back in 1531, these particular stories were already being carefully, faithfully passed along entirely by voice, generation after generation, keeping the city's true, accurate history genuinely alive without ever needing a single written page to properly do it. Great Zimbabwe itself sits on a granite plateau dotted throughout with natural, dome-shaped rock outcrops known locally as KOPs, features that quite directly shaped exactly where the site's earliest walls were first carefully laid down by builders working with, not against, the land. The original builders didn't simply impose their own design blindly onto an entirely empty, blank landscape, the way a modern architect cleared lot. They read the surrounding land carefully first, letting its existing granite bones quietly help decide where the city's own future bones would eventually rise around them, wall by patient wall. Builders frequently deliberately incorporated these natural granite KOPs directly into the walls of the hill complex, blending genuinely deliberate architecture seamlessly into the landscape's own pre-existing natural formations, rather than clearing them away first. Standing there quietly today, it can be genuinely difficult, even for a careful, trained observer, to tell exactly where the natural stone formation ends and the human-built wall properly begins, which feels, in its own quiet way, precisely like the entire original point the builders were reaching for all along. Excavated ivory offcuts suggest that skilled craftsmen working at the site carved elephant tusks into finished, polished trade goods and ornamental objects, adding yet another entire skilled craft tradition to the city's already considerable list of accomplishments beyond stone and gold. Ivory carving demanded patience and precision, every bit as exacting as the stonework happening just outside the workshop walls, simply operating on a considerably smaller, more intimate, more personal scale by comparison. Held close in careful hands rather than raised toward the sky, some researchers estimate that more than half of all the gold ever mined across pre-colonial southern Africa passed, at some point along the way, through the wider Zimbabwe culture's extensive trading network stretching from the interior to the coast. That represents an extraordinary share of an entire subcontinent's mineral wealth funneled steadily through a whole series of stone-walled cities whose true full-scale and lasting influence outside historians only fully began to properly appreciate generations after the fact, long after the walls themselves had gone quiet and the trade routes had shifted elsewhere. The rival trading city of Mapungubwe, situated further to the southwest across the Limpio-Hpo River, is now understood by modern researchers as an earlier, somewhat smaller predecessor to Great Zimbabwe's own later, eventual rise to regional prominence and wealth. Before there was ever a great Zimbabwe rising on its own hillside, there was already an established tradition of walled hilltop settlements carefully controlling regional trade in gold and ivory. Mapungubwe simply came first, quietly laying the groundwork the later, larger city would eventually build upon and ultimately surpass entirely in scale and reach. Mapungubwe's own golden rhinoceros artifact, carefully unearthed by excavators back in the 1930s from beneath a royal burial, offered archaeologists an early, genuinely striking clue to just how sophisticated the wider region's metalworking traditions actually were, even well before Great Zimbabwe itself reached its own later peak of influence. A small, gleaming golden animal, patiently hammered from thin gold leaf wrapped around a wooden core, quietly proving a level of craftsmanship far beyond anything casual outside assumption had ever really expected to find waiting there in the soil. The gradual, steady shift of political and trading power from Mapungubwe toward Great Zimbabwe, occurring roughly around the 13th century, as one city's influence waned and another's grew, remains today a genuinely active and engaging area of ongoing archaeological research and debate among specialists. Cities, much like the individual people who patiently build them stone by stone, don't simply appear fully formed out of nothing at all overnight. They rise, quite often, gradually in the shadow of an earlier city's own slow decline, quietly inheriting both its ambitions and its hard-won lessons along the way forward. Portuguese chroniclers who eventually reached the distant Mutiahpa court, many generations after Great Zimbabwe's own decline, had already faded into memory, carefully described its rulers, observing elaborate customs of divine kingship, almost certainly inherited directly from Great Zimbabwe's own original royal traditions, passed down through the centuries. Authority, once firmly established somewhere on a hillside like this one, has a genuine way of carrying its own particular rituals steadily forward, faithfully, even long after the specific walls that first housed them have gone entirely quiet and still beneath the grass. Some of Great Zimbabwe's stone walls were deliberately built with a slight outward lean or batter, specifically intended to improve their long-term structural stability across many future centuries of weather and settling ground beneath them. It's a genuinely subtle engineering choice, nearly invisible to any casual passing glance from a visitor walking by, yet directly responsible for helping certain sections of wall remain firmly standing today, more than 600 years after they were first carefully, patiently set into place by hand, one block resting confidently on the next. The site's largest standing walls are estimated to contain roughly 1 million individual granite blocks in total, an almost genuinely impossible number to properly hold in mind all at once. Sitting quietly here tonight trying to picture it. Each single block, however small a fraction of that enormous total, it ultimately represents among so many others, still required its own distinct moment of focused human attention, carefully chosen from the hillside, patiently shaped by hand, physically carried into position, and finally, deliberately set exactly where it needed to permanently rest for centuries to come. Remarkably, no two granite blocks anywhere across the entire site were ever mortared together with any binding paste at all. And yet many of these same dry-stacked walls have now stood firmly, reliably for well over 600 consecutive years. Through every season the plateau has offered. It remains one of the most quietly persuasive arguments the ruins continue to make simply by still existing today, unbroken, solid proof that patience and precision alone, entirely without any binding agent whatsoever, can genuinely outlast almost anything else humans have ever built with far more modern tools. Colonial era postcards and popular tourist guides once routinely captioned photographs of the ruins with entirely invented Phoenician or Arab building crews that, in reality, never actually existed anywhere in the genuine historical record of the region or its trade. These weren't simply innocent, careless mistakes made in passing by an overworked printer. They were deliberate, repeated fictions, printed and distributed widely enough over the years to quietly shape exactly what generations of casual visitors already assumed they knew, long before ever actually setting foot on the site itself to see the walls firsthand. Rhodesia's white minority government went so far as to formally instruct the site's own official guidebook to carefully avoid stating plainly that the ruins were African built. Even many decades after professional archaeology had already settled the underlying question well beyond any reasonable doubt among trained researchers. A government publication, printed carefully and handed directly to every paying visitor at the gate, quietly built from the ground up to mislead rather than to honestly, plainly inform the very people who had traveled to see it. After independence finally arrived in 1980, restoring the true, accurate origin story of Great Zimbabwe became a genuinely important, deliberate act of national memory for the newly formed Zimbabwean government working to define itself. It wasn't only ever about simply correcting a dry historical record somewhere in a dusty textbook. It It was about an entire nation deliberately reclaiming ownership of its own deepest, most tangible achievement. After decades spent quietly watching that same achievement be steadily, systematically denied to it by people who had never built anything half so lasting themselves. Archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson herself wrote quite plainly that the ruins represented a class of native structure hitherto unsuspected or peremptorily denied, a carefully chosen phrase that managed to capture, in a single measured sentence, exactly the stubborn resistance her own honest findings had already quietly encountered from colleagues and colonial officials alike. Even back in 1929, decades before independence, she clearly understood precisely what kind of deeply entrenched assumption her own careful evidence was genuinely up against, and chose her words with evident care. Catton Thompson's excavation team used newly developed stratigraphic dating methods that were, for their particular era, remarkably rigorous and genuinely forward-thinking in their careful approach to the soil itself, setting a considerably higher scientific standard against which her predecessors' looser, more assumption-driven conclusions could finally, fairly be measured and properly found wanting by later scholars. Good method, applied honestly and consistently across an entire excavation, has a genuine way of quietly exposing exactly how careless earlier work had actually, truly been all along. However confident it once sounded in print, later radiocarbon analysis, conducted independently in the mid-20th century, using an entirely different scientific technique than Catton Thompson herself had access to, went on to confirm the very same medieval dating that her team had already carefully proposed decades earlier, relying only on stratigraphy and pottery analysis at the time available to them. Two entirely different scientific methods applied decades apart from one another by different researchers working independently, arrived independently at the identical final answer. Sometimes that particular kind of quiet, repeated agreement across methods is genuinely the most convincing evidence of all available to a careful mind. Excavated grain bins and storage pits scattered carefully across the site point, clearly to an economy genuinely capable of storing meaningful surplus food year after year, enough to comfortably support thousands of residents who weren't themselves directly engaged in farming the land day to day beyond the city walls. Feeding a city of this considerable size required careful, deliberate planning, stretched across entire growing seasons, not simply the daily improvisation of gathering whatever happened to be available nearby that particular morning when hunger struck. Some estimates suggest the great Zimbabwe state ultimately controlled trade and tribute across an area even larger than the modern country that now proudly bears its name on maps today. Its political and economic reach, in other words, likely extended considerably beyond the stone walls visitors can still quietly walk through today on a guided tour stretching steadily outward across a much wider swath of the surrounding region than casual assumption typically allows for when standing only within the enclosure itself. Objects recovered carefully from the ruins now sit scattered widely across museum collections worldwide, many of them acquired specifically during the era of unregulated colonial excavation, when careful, proper documentation mattered far less to eager collectors than simply acquiring something visually impressive to display back home in a glass case. Pieces of a single, coherent history broken apart and shipped off to distant shelves in cities the original builders never knew existed, each one now sitting quietly far from the very walls it once belonged directly beside for centuries. Zimbabwean heritage authorities have worked steadily for years with real, sustained persistence and considerable patience to have some of these dispersed artifacts formally, properly repatriated back to the country they originally, rightfully came from generations ago. It is slow, careful, often genuinely frustrating diplomatic work, carried out object by object, institution by institution, letter by letter, each successful return representing its own small, hard-won correction to a much larger, long-standing, historical imbalance still being addressed today. In recent years, researchers have begun using ground-penetrating radar to map buried foundations and features across the site without disturbing a single stone or a single layer of soil, a technique that would have been entirely unimaginable to Catton Thompson or Randall MacIver in their own era of careful trowel work, where earlier archaeologists had to dig, sometimes destructively, simply to see what lay beneath the surface. Today's researchers can quietly peer downward through solid ground itself, reading buried structure the way earlier generations could only read what was already standing in plain sight above it. Drone-based photogrammetry has also been used to build detailed, centimeter-accurate three-dimensional models of the entire ruins, capturing wall condition and subtle structural movement over time far more precisely than any hand-drawn survey ever managed in earlier decades of study. Conservators can now compare these detailed digital models year over year, watching for the earliest, faintest signs of stress or settling long before any change would ever become visible to an ordinary visitor's naked eye walking past. This same detailed digital mapping has proven especially valuable for conservation planning, allowing heritage authorities to prioritize exactly which sections of wall most urgently need careful, immediate attention, rather than spreading limited restoration funding thinly and inefficiently across the entire 1,800-acre site all at once. 600 years of patient stonework deserves, at the very least, an equally patient and carefully targeted approach to keeping it standing for 600 more. Beyond Zimbabwe's own borders, a related stone-walled site called Monyikeyechni sits far to the east in present-day Mozambique, sharing many of the same architectural principles and trade connections that defined Great Zimbabwe itself. Evidence that this particular building tradition reached considerably further across the region than the country's modern borders might otherwise suggest to a casual visitor today. Political maps drawn centuries later rarely respect the older, deeper boundaries. A shared building tradition once quietly traced across the landscape on its own terms. Smaller Zimbabwe culture sites, with names like Tsindi and Chumnungwa, dot the wider Zimbabwean landscape by the hundreds, each one a considerably smaller echo of the same dry stone building tradition, most of them still only partially studied or documented even now, after more than a century of dedicated regional archaeology. It's genuinely humbling to consider tonight just how much careful, patient work still remains scattered across these quiet hills, waiting for researchers who haven't been born, yet to eventually walk out and carefully begin it. Excavated fragments of iron gongs and carefully carved wooden musical instruments hint at a rich, vibrant musical tradition, once filling these same stone enclosures with sound, rhythm, and shared celebration on ordinary evenings, much like this one. Stone survives centuries remarkably well underground and in open air alike. Sound, unfortunately, does not preserve nearly so easily or so patiently, leaving us only the quiet instruments themselves and none of the actual melodies they were once so carefully, deliberately built to carry outward across the valley below. Daga, a carefully prepared mixture of clay and gravel, was used extensively throughout the site to construct smooth household floors and low interior walls within the royal enclosures, a building material considerably less permanent than stacked granite, yet still surprisingly durable when properly, patiently prepared and maintained by skilled hands. Traces of these DAHGA floors, carefully smoothed and polished by generations of bare feet passing steadily over them, still survive in patches today, quiet evidence of the genuinely ordinary domestic life that once filled every space between the grander, more famous stone walls. Excavators have also recovered clay figurines, small carved animals, and human forms scattered throughout the site's residential areas, objects that likely served children as ordinary toys, or perhaps functioned in small, quiet domestic rituals within individual households across the wider settlement. Great empires, it's worth remembering gently tonight, are never actually built entirely from gold and stone alone. They are built, in the end, from thousands of small, ordinary days like any other, filled with children playing quietly with small clay animals in the dust just outside their own front door. Textile impressions preserved accidentally in fired clay have given researchers rare, genuinely valuable clues about weaving patterns and cloth production at the site. Indirect traces of an entire craft tradition that otherwise would have left behind no evidence at all, given how completely actual woven fabric decomposes within just a few short decades underground. Sometimes the most valuable evidence a site can offer isn't the object itself at all, but merely the accidental, fossil-like impression it happened to leave behind in something else more durable nearby. Archaeobotanical studies of preserved plant remains recovered from the site indicate that sorghum and millet formed the core of the local agricultural diet, supplemented steadily by the cattle herds that grazed the surrounding grassland year-round in every season. These were resilient, genuinely well-adapted crops for the region's particular climate, capable of reliably supporting a large, settled population across most years, though clearly, as we've already discussed tonight, not quite resilient enough to fully weather the sustained drought that eventually contributed to the city's own gradual decline centuries later. Beeswax residue found on certain pottery fragments suggests honey and beeswax formed a genuine part of the local economy as well, likely traded alongside gold and ivory as a smaller, sweeter, but still genuinely valuable local commodity moving through the same wider trading networks. It's a small, quietly pleasant detail to hold onto tonight, resting here in the dark, that alongside all the gold and grand architecture, someone at Great Zimbabwe was also, quite ordinarily, simply keeping bees and carefully gathering honey. The same simple pleasure people still quietly pursue today. All these centuries later, the University of Zimbabwe's own archaeology department has trained multiple successive generations of local researchers to study and carefully protect the site directly, deliberately shifting the balance of expertise steadily away from the foreign-led excavations that had so thoroughly, so problematically defined the site's earlier colonial era history for decades. It represents, in its own quiet way, one further correction layered on top of all the others we've discussed tonight, not merely correcting who gets properly credited for building the walls, but also, just as importantly, correcting who gets to lead the careful, ongoing work of studying and protecting them today. International archaeological conferences now regularly feature Great Zimbabwe as a central case study, specifically in the ethics of archaeological practice, examined carefully alongside its own considerable historical significance as a site in its own right. Its complicated history has become, in an unexpected but genuinely fitting way, a valuable teaching tool in its own right, helping train an entirely new generation of researchers to recognize political bias at work in a field that has not always, historically, been nearly so honest with itself about its own past mistakes. The site's valley enclosures, a cluster of considerably smaller stone-walled compounds situated below the main central hill and spreading out across the flatter ground, most likely housed ordinary residents rather than any royalty or elite officials living among the grander structures above. Not every single wall at Great Zimbabwe was built purely to impress a distant visitor arriving from far away. Some were simply built to quietly shelter an ordinary, everyday family and their few possessions, tucked in the shadow of the grander, taller structures rising above them on the hillside. Notably, excavators have never actually identified any single grand palace anywhere at Great Zimbabwe, despite decades of careful searching through every section of the ruins, suggesting political power here may instead have been distributed carefully across several separate, linked royal residences rather than concentrated tightly in one obvious center. It genuinely complicates the tidy mental image most people carry of a single throne room somewhere at the very heart of the ruins, replacing it instead with something considerably more diffuse, and arguably, in the end, considerably more interesting to actually study. This persistent absence of any one obvious throne room has made reconstructing the site's exact political structure genuinely difficult for archaeologists working carefully from physical evidence alone, without the benefit of any surviving written record to consult directly, without any clearly labeled seat of power anywhere to point to on a map. Researchers are left instead to patiently infer authority from architecture, scale, and careful placement of walls relative to one another. It amounts to a considerably slower, more uncertain kind of detective work than simply conveniently reading a name off a door somewhere in the ruins. Recent scholarship increasingly frames Great Zimbabwe less as a single king's own personal capital city ruled from one throne, and considerably more as the vibrant, active center of a broad regional trading confederation, spreading both authority and accumulated wealth across a much wider network of linked communities beyond the main walls themselves. It's a picture considerably more complex, and arguably, in the end, considerably more genuinely impressive than the simpler, more familiar story of one all-powerful ruler commanding a single obedient city beneath him from a single seat of power, because Great Zimbabwe left behind no manuscripts of its own, no scrolls or tablets recording its own version of events. Its rich intellectual and religious life must be carefully reconstructed almost entirely from stone, soil, and surviving oral tradition, rather than from any direct written record left conveniently behind for later scholars to simply translate. It asks something genuinely different of the people patiently studying it today: real patience and a sincere willingness to listen carefully to evidence that never quite speaks as plainly, as directly, as a written page of text ordinarily would to a trained reader. German ethnologist Elicho Frobihnius visited the ruins in 1929, the very same year as Catton Thompson's own careful excavation, and unlike her, he continued insisting publicly that the site's true origins must lie somewhere outside Africa entirely, clinging to old assumptions even as the professional evidence around him was actively, visibly settling the question once and for all. Two visitors, standing on the very same hillside in the very same year, looking at the very same stones, and reaching two entirely different conclusions, not because the evidence itself was genuinely unclear, but because one of them was still, quite simply, unwilling to let it speak for itself. J. Theodore Bent's original 1891 report specifically claimed to identify Phoenician-style architectural details in the ruins' stonework, comparing the walls to ancient Mediterranean building techniques that, on any careful, honest inspection, actually share remarkably little in common with the site's genuinely distinctive dry stone granite construction. It's worth remembering that Bent was not simply a careless amateur working without proper training. He was a professionally credentialed researcher of his own era, which makes his willingness to reach so far for a comparison that barely held up even by contemporary standards all the more telling about the pressures shaping his conclusions. The particular coursing technique used throughout the great enclosure's outer wall, with each individual stone carefully selected and precisely fitted to interlock securely with its immediate neighbors on every side, demanded a genuinely sophisticated three-dimensional spatial understanding that modern engineers, examining the walls today with considerably more advanced tools at their disposal, still openly, genuinely admire. It wasn't simply stacking. It was closer, in its own quiet way, to solving an enormous, patient puzzle in stone, one block at a time, entirely by hand, entirely from memory and practiced skill. Modern structural engineers who have carefully studied the walls note that their gentle, deliberate curve actually provides considerably greater structural stability than a straight wall of comparable height and length ever could achieve on its own. The builders of Great Zimbabwe, it turns out, had independently discovered a genuinely sound engineering principle, now taught formally in universities worldwide, arriving at it entirely through patient practice and careful observation, centuries before anyone had ever written the underlying mathematics down on paper anywhere. The plateau surrounding Great Zimbabwe supports a genuinely rich variety of wildlife even today, including sizable troops of baboons that still climb freely and confidently across the very same ancient walls their distant ancestors likely also once wandered over, centuries before any single stone was ever laid down by human hands. There's something quietly, almost comically fitting about that image tonight. An empire once so carefully, deliberately built to project human authority and lasting permanence, now patiently shared each ordinary day with creatures who have never once needed to read a single wall to understand exactly, instinctively, what it's for. Saw trees, their leaves turning a genuinely striking, deep copper red each autumn across the surrounding hillsides, frame the ruins in a color that shifts steadily and beautifully with each passing season, changing the entire hillside's mood and appearance as the year quietly turns. Whoever first walked among these particular walls 7 or 8 centuries ago now likely watched those very same trees change color too, season after season, in exactly the same slow, patient rhythm that still continues today, entirely unbothered by everything that has happened in the many centuries in between. The Zimbabwean government now requires specialized professional training and formal certification for any tour guide working directly at the site, specifically to ensure the accurate, well-supported historical narrative is consistently, reliably shared with every single visitor who passes through the gates. It stands as one further small, deliberate safeguard against the exact same kind of casual historical distortion that so thoroughly shaped public understanding of the ruins for the better part of an entire troubled century beforehand. Local community elders are also regularly, formally consulted on heritage management decisions affecting the site today, ensuring the ruins remain genuinely actively connected to the very descendant communities whose own ancestors most likely built and originally lived within these same walls so many centuries ago. Heritage, properly understood and properly managed, was never really meant to belong solely to distant museums and formal academic institutions alone. It belongs, first and always, to the people who trace their own living history directly back to it. Some of the site's original stone monoliths, the very same tall posts that once quietly held the 8 carved soapstone birds aloft above the enclosure walls, still stand today in their own original positions, patiently weathered, but genuinely, remarkably intact after so many centuries of open exposure to sun, wind, and steady rain. Their carved birds are gone now, safely moved elsewhere for careful conservation and protection, but the tall stone posts themselves remain exactly where they were first, deliberately raised, quietly marking the empty space where each individual bird once perched and watched. Great Zimbabwe's story has, in recent decades, increasingly found its own place within broader university courses on the history and ethics of archaeology as a discipline taught now specifically alongside other well-known case studies of colonial era bias, distorting careful scientific interpretation elsewhere around the world. Students studying archaeology today learn this particular story, not only for what the walls themselves can properly teach them about medieval African civilization, but equally for what the century of denial surrounding them can still teach about the genuine, ongoing need for real intellectual honesty in any careful field of study. The ruins were briefly, formally considered for inclusion on UNESCO's own list of World Heritage Sites, specifically in danger during a period of political and economic instability within Zimbabwe itself. Though careful, sustained conservation efforts by dedicated local heritage authorities ultimately successfully kept that particular designation from becoming necessary, even during considerable national hardship and uncertainty. Protecting these particular walls remained a genuine, quiet priority for the people directly responsible for their ongoing care. Local legend holds that the spirit of Mwari, the Shona high god, was once worshipped directly within the hill complex itself, and some present-day traditional and spiritual practitioners still consider parts of the wider site to be genuinely, actively sacred ground even now, many centuries after the city's original royal residents themselves moved on elsewhere. A ruin, understood this particular way, is never purely only a museum piece to be studied at arm's length from a safe, respectful distance. For some, quietly, it remains something considerably closer to a living, active place of ongoing reverence and careful spiritual practice. Comparative studies with other great medieval trading cities scattered around the world, Timbuktu in West Africa, or Angkor in Southeast Asia, have helped situate Great Zimbabwe within a genuinely much broader global pattern of powerful, sophisticated cities, rising specifically along major medieval trade routes, each one shaped considerably by the particular resources and particular geography immediately surrounding it. Great Zimbabwe was never some strange, isolated anomaly sitting alone and unprecedented on its own hillside. It was one genuinely notable, well-documented expression of a pattern repeating quietly, steadily across the entire medieval world at roughly the very same time. Textbooks used in Zimbabwean schools today devote considerable, careful attention to the ruins' true history and to the specific, documented colonial era denial that once so thoroughly, deliberately surrounded them, ensuring new generations of students properly understand both halves of this particular story in full, rather than only the more comfortable, simpler half. Knowing merely that the walls were built by African hands is, in the end, only half the story worth carefully, patiently telling. Knowing precisely why that simple, obvious fact was once so stubbornly denied for so long is, in its own way, equally, genuinely important to properly understand and remember excavated cattle bone deposits, carefully sorted and studied at length by patient archaeologists, sifting through centuries of discarded remains. Hint that specific, particular cuts of meat were likely reserved specifically for higher status households within the wider community gathered around the walls. Even something as genuinely ordinary as a single discarded bone, buried and quietly forgotten for centuries beneath the soil, can end up patiently revealing the outline of an entire social hierarchy. Once someone finally takes the careful time to look closely enough at what remains. Anthropologists studying nearby present-day Shona communities have drawn thoughtfully, carefully on still living local customs and traditions to help properly interpret certain features of the much older ancient site itself, bridging past and present through careful observation. The past, understood this way, was never entirely sealed off permanently behind cold stone walls, the way a museum exhibit might suggest. Living tradition, faithfully carried forward through many generations of the same communities, has continued quietly offering its own valuable kind of insight into questions archaeology alone simply can't always fully, completely answer on its own from stone and soil. Some rainmaking ceremonies, specifically tied to the ruins, are still faithfully performed today by local spiritual leaders during periods of drought, continuing a genuine relationship between people and place that likely stretches back many centuries, long before any formal excavation had even properly begun to disturb the soil. The stones themselves, for these particular communities gathered nearby, were never simply historical artifacts locked away behind glass. They have remained all along, quietly and consistently sacred to the people who live nearby and still visit with genuine reverence. In the years directly following independence, early post-colonial Zimbabwean scholars firmly insisted that the site's true, accurate history finally be taught properly within the nation's own schools, correcting decades of deliberately vague or genuinely misleading colonial-era instruction handed down to earlier generations of students. It was slow, patient work, carefully rewriting textbooks page by page and training an entirely new generation of teachers to finally say plainly, confidently, what the evidence had already quietly proven true for decades beforehand, waiting only for permission to be spoken. Great Zimbabwe now appears prominently on Zimbabwean banknotes issued after independence, further cementing its central role as the nation's own defining symbol of identity and historical continuity, carried in every pocket and purse. Every single transaction carried out using that currency quietly carries a small piece of the ruins along with it, a gentle reminder folded neatly into something as genuinely ordinary as buying bread or paying a bus fare on the way home from a long day's work. The ruins were also actively used as a powerful, resonant political rallying image throughout Zimbabwe's independence movement across the 1970s, offering a tangible, undeniable symbol of African achievement and self-determination to a population working steadily, often at great cost, towards self-rule and freedom. A wall built centuries earlier for entirely different, unrelated reasons found itself, quite unexpectedly, doing brand new work in an entirely different century's own struggle for freedom, carried on banners and spoken of at rallies far from the hillside itself. The Zimbabwe culture's dry stone tradition also influenced burial practices across the region, with some elite graves incorporating carefully stacked stone cairns echoing on a much smaller and more intimate scale the same building logic found in the great walls above them. Even in death, it seems the same patient language of stacked, unmortared granite continued quietly speaking, carried from the grandest enclosure down to the smallest, most personal resting place, local place. Names throughout the surrounding region still carry, quietly embedded within them, references to the old stone building tradition, preserved faithfully in everyday language long after the specific historical details behind them faded gradually from common, active memory. Language, in its own patient way, often remembers considerably longer than any single written record manages to survive intact, carrying small fragments of the past forward simply through the ordinary act of a place, continuing to be called by its old, familiar name. Contemporary Zimbabwean artists frequently draw direct inspiration from the site's carved soapstone birds and distinctive dry stone architectural patterns, incorporating those same familiar forms into modern sculpture, painting, and textile design sold and displayed today. A tradition first carved 8 centuries ago continues finding entirely new expression in galleries and craft markets today. Proof that inspiration, properly rooted deeply enough in a place, genuinely never fully runs out, no matter how many centuries pass in between. Every August, Zimbabwe formally observes a National Heritage Day, with Great Zimbabwe frequently serving as the central symbolic focus of official public celebrations and ceremonies held specifically to honor the country's own deep, layered cultural history. A single hillside, once so thoroughly denied its rightful place in the official historical record, now anchors an entire nation's annual public celebration of exactly the kind of achievement it so plainly, undeniably represents. School children across Zimbabwe regularly visit the ruins on carefully organized educational trips, walking the very same stone passages their own distant ancestors likely once walked themselves centuries ago, connecting each new young generation directly and tangibly to this deep physical inheritance. There's something quietly, genuinely moving in picturing that scene tonight. Children's voices, curious and unhurried, echoing gently across the very same walls that colonial authorities once worked so very hard, for so very long, to keep silent about entirely. The site's official custodians continue working steadily, patiently alongside international conservation partners to secure long-term sustainable funding for the wall's ongoing protection and careful maintenance, balancing real, urgent present-day needs against an achievement that has already remarkably endured for more than 600 years. 6 centuries of patient standing is a genuinely difficult thing to responsibly plan for another 6 centuries more. And yet, quietly, carefully, that is precisely the work still steadily continuing today. Comparative genetic and linguistic studies of present-day Shona-speaking communities continue to refine scholarly understanding of exactly how various regional populations across the plateau relate historically to Great Zimbabwe's own original builders and residents. Even now, more than a century after Randall MacIver first properly settled the basic question of origin, entirely new scientific tools keep gently, patiently adding fresh layers of genuinely useful detail an already well-established, thoroughly confirmed picture. A smaller, considerably less visited set of terraced stone platforms near Nyanga reveals a separate, genuinely sophisticated pre-colonial farming society that once operated not far from Great Zimbabwe's own wider sphere of influence and trade. These quiet agricultural terraces rarely draw the same level of attention from visitors as the great stone walls found elsewhere on the plateau. Yet, they represent their own equally impressive feat of careful, patient land engineering, carried out over many patient generations, working the same hillsides. Some researchers see the Nyanga terraces as broader evidence that sophisticated stone construction and land engineering skills were genuinely widespread across the entire wider region, rather than some unique, isolated achievement belonging to Great Zimbabwe alone on its own hillside. It thoughtfully reframes the ruins, in the end, not as some isolated miracle standing entirely apart from everything around it, but instead as one especially prominent, especially visible expression of skills, clearly shared much more widely across an entire ancient landscape full of quieter, less celebrated achievements. Great Zimbabwe's example has, in recent years, quietly encouraged renewed archaeological interest in other understudied stone-walled sites scattered across southern Africa, many of which had been almost entirely overlooked for decades, specifically because they didn't carry Great Zimbabwe's own singular, internationally famous name and reputation. Fame, it turns out, has its own quiet way of shaping where careful scholarly attention actually flows, sometimes leaving equally worthy, equally patient sites waiting considerably longer than they probably should for their own proper, careful turn. Researchers continue actively debating the precise total population Great Zimbabwe's wider surrounding region could have sustainably supported at the civilization's own genuine peak, with estimates varying considerably depending on which specific agricultural and rainfall assumptions any given study happens to use in its own careful modeling. Even settled, well-established history, it turns out, still leaves comfortable, genuine room for careful, ongoing scholarly disagreement about the precise details. Long after the much larger, more fundamental questions have already been thoroughly resolved, the site's careful preservation today stands as a quiet, living rebuke to every single visitor and every single official who once looked directly at these same walls generations ago and simply chose not to believe their own eyes. Stone, it turns out, is remarkably patient. It waited a full century for the truth to finally, properly catch up with it, and then it simply, quietly kept standing, exactly as it always had, entirely unbothered by how long that particular reckoning ultimately, genuinely took to arrive. Tonight, as we finally come to the last of these 100 and more small stories, it's worth sitting for a moment with just how much of this history was nearly permanently lost, not to time or weather or the ordinary decay every ancient site must eventually face, but to simple, stubborn human unwillingness to believe an obvious, plainly visible truth standing directly in front of it. The walls survived that particular danger too, patiently, the same way they survived every other one before it. Even after roughly 150 years of dedicated, sustained study by careful researchers from many countries, no full written record of who specifically ruled from Great Zimbabwe, or in precisely what order they reigned over the growing city, has ever actually been properly recovered by anyone. Kings and queens likely walked these very same stone passages for centuries on end, holding court and settling disputes beneath these same walls. And yet, not one single one of their actual names has survived intact into the present day, waiting patiently to be read by anyone at all. That persistent, quiet absence of any surviving king list remains one of the site's most genuinely unresolved mysteries, even today, long after nearly everything else about its true origin has already been so thoroughly, carefully settled by generations of patient researchers working independently. Sometimes, it seems, even a fully solved mystery leaves behind one smaller mystery entirely of its own, tucked quietly inside the larger answer like a stone inside a wall, patiently waiting its own eventual turn to be understood by someone yet to come. In the end, every single stone within the great enclosure's towering walls was set entirely by careful hand, without a single nail anywhere in the entire structure, without one drop of mortar anywhere holding it together, and without any name ever formally attached to the individual mason who originally placed it there so many centuries ago. Whoever they truly were, one careful stone at a time, working through entire lifetimes without ever seeing the whole finished wall themselves, they built something that would eventually quietly outlast their own names, outlast their own spoken language even, and outlast the willful blindness of everyone who later refused, for far too long to believe they had ever genuinely existed at all. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's long, quiet walk through great Zimbabwe. We've moved from a single Shona phrase, houses of stone, all the way to a modern nation's flag and currency, carrying that same old carving forward into ordinary daily life, a continent and centuries away from where it began. We've walked beside a wall that curves for hundreds of meters without a single drop of mortar, stood quietly beneath a tower with no door and no fully settled purpose, and traced gold as it traveled patiently from narrow, hand-dug shafts on a quiet plateau all the way to distant ports and markets an entire ocean away, and further still beyond that. We've met careful, patient archaeologists working decades apart, sometimes without ever meeting one another, who kept arriving independently at the very same honest answer the stones had been offering all along. And we've sat, too, with a genuinely harder part of the story tonight. A full century of explorers and officials who looked directly at careful, honest evidence and simply chose, again and again, deliberately, not to believe it, because the truth was inconvenient to the story they preferred to tell. What ties all of it together isn't really the stone itself at all, remarkable as it undeniably is after 600 years of standing. It's something quieter than that, the same patient, stubborn persistence that first raised a wall 11 meters into open sky without a single tool sharp enough to properly cut the granite directly. And the very same patient, stubborn persistence that, generations later, kept gently insisting on the plain truth until enough people were, finally, genuinely willing to hear it spoken aloud. Karl Moak looked at these same walls and saw almost anything but their true builders standing in front of him in the afternoon light. Gertrude Catton Thompson looked at the very same walls decades later with the very same eyes any of us might have, and simply, plainly told the truth about what she saw there. The stones themselves never changed at all, not once, across all those years of doubt and denial. Only, eventually, the willingness of the people looking at them actually changed enough to finally see them clearly for exactly what they had always been. If your mind is still quietly resting somewhere among granite walls and carved stone birds tonight, that's perfectly all right. There's nothing left to hold on to now, nothing you need to remember for later. Let your jaw loosen once more. Let your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you up right now, mattress or couch or chair, wherever tonight happens to have quietly found you resting. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last one. The way an old stone wall finally settles once the very last hand that shaped it has quietly, gently let go and moved on. If you're still awake and still wanting more, there's another video very much like this one waiting for you whenever you need it. Another slow, quiet walk through the ancient past, ready to carry you the rest of the way to sleep whenever you're ready for it. But for now, there's nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do tonight. The walls will still be standing tomorrow, exactly where they've quietly stood for 600 years, patient, unmortared, and finally, rightfully believed by the world that once refused to see them clearly. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.